Spoiler alert.
What follows is a brief construction montage.
Late again. You are an idiot.
Limited time only.
Flashback.
While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how Spongebob's party is shaping up.
End of flashback. Soon after. Soon after. Montage. Previously.
Yesterday. Meanwhile. Meanwhile.
Meanwhile. Meanwhile. Meanwhile. Meanwhile.
Meanwhile. Meanwhile.
Meanwhile.
Meanwhile.
Meanwhile. Meanwhile.
At the Krusty Krab.
Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. Meanwhile, deep in the kelp forest. Meanwhile, back on the Patrick Show. Meanwhile, in the city.
Meanwhile in Ulacity.
Meanwhile, in Merquisive. Meanwhile, at the palace of King Poseidon, ruler of the seven seas.
A few moments later.
A few moments later. A few moments later. Moments later. Moments later. Moments later. Many moments later. Many moments later. Many unbearable moments later. More moments later. A little later.
A little later.
A while later. A little while later.
Later. Later.
Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later. Later.
Later.
Later. Later.
Later. Later. Later.
Later. In the void. Later still. Later that evening. Happy friendiversary.
Later that same evening.
Later that day. Later that day. Later that same whoopsie-doodle day. Later that night. Later that night. Later that night. More laterer.
Much later.
Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Much later. Not much later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The following Thursday.
You get the idea.
Just then.
By sheer coincidence.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m. 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
5:02 p.m. 8:01 p.m.
A half a second later. 1 second later.
1 second later.
1 second later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 1 nanosecond later.
2 seconds later. 2 seconds later.
3 seconds later. 5 seconds later.
7 seconds later.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later. 12 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
13 seconds later.
15 seconds later. 40 seconds later.
47 seconds later. 47 seconds later. 47 seconds later.
50 seconds later. A few seconds later.
A few seconds later. A few seconds later. Many seconds later. 1 minute later. 1 minute later.
1 minute and 7 seconds earlier!
69 seconds later. 69 seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Banjo Dukes 1 minute 40 seconds later.
2 minutes later.
2 minutes later.
2 very boring minutes later. 203 seconds later. Approximately 275 minutes
Second.
later. It a day very boring. Then approximately 275 seconds later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 5 minutes later.
7 minutes later.
10 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 11 minutes later.
12 minutes later. After Doris fell asleep.
15 minutes ago. 15 minutes later.
15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
A few minutes later.
A few minutes later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Many, many minutes later.
A half hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later.
1 hour later.
1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 1 hour later. 80 minutes later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later.
2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later.
3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
3 hours later.
3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later. 3 hours later.
4 hours later. 4 to 6 hours later. 4 to 6 more hours later.
5 hours later. 5 hours later. 346 minutes later.
6 hours later. 6 hours later.
6 hours later.
6.5 hours later.
7 hours later.
8 hours later.
8 hours later. 9 hours later.
9.25 hours later.
10 hours later. Approximately 10 hours later. 11 hours later.
12 hours later.
12 sleepless hours later.
12 sleepless hours later.
14 hours later. Several hours later. 24 sleepless hours later. A few hours later. Several hard-hitting hours later. Several soda-fueled hours later.
Several song-filled hours later.
Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours later. Many hours of fun time later. Many adorable hours later. Many boring hours of cleaning later. Many chilly hours later. Many unbearable hours later.
Tomorrow for sure.
24 hours later. 24 hours later. Early the next morning. Stupid early the next morning. 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 The next. The next morning. 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 Like every morning.
The next day.
The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day. The next day in a parallel universe. The very next day. The following day.
Tomorrow.
The very next evening. The next evening.
The next evening.
The next Christmas. Next level. Days later. 1 day later. 1 full day of fatherly fun later.
Day 2. 48 hours later.
2 days later.
50 hours later.
Day 3. 72 hours later. 3 days later.
3 days later. 3 days later. 3 days later.
Day 4.
4 to 6 days later. 4 to 6 more days later.
98 hours later.
99 hours later.
100 hours later. 5 days later.
6 messy days later. Several days later.
Several days later.
Several days later. Several days later. Several long days later.
8 days later.
Many disorderly days later.
1 week later. 1 week later.
1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 week later. 1 smelly week later. 1 soggy week later. 1 weekend of pampering later.
2 weeks later.
2 weeks later. 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later.
16 paranoia-filled days later.
3 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later. 6 to 8 weeks later. Several weeks later.
1 month later. 2 months later. 3 months later.
5 months later. 6 months later. 6 months later.
6 months later!
7 months later.
Several months later. Many months later.
Months and months of pointless quarantine and depression later.
12 years later.
70 years later.
75 years later.
1,000 years later.
2,000 years later.
2,000-ish years later.
3,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
4,000-ish years later.
1 decade later. 2 million decades later.
1 entree later. An eternity later. An eternity later.
1 eternity later.
Opening night. A couple of hours later.
A lot of boring math later.
A lot of wallpapers later.
Very boring walk later.
Many frame building attempts later. Many heartfelt traditions later. Many attempts to fix the past later.
Many attempts to fix the glove balloon later.
Many amusements later.
Many buckets later!
Many exam questions later. Many invitations later. Many meeps later. Many meeps later. Many memories later. Many miles later. Many repressed memories later. Many plays later. Many superstitions later. Many tic-tacs later. Many secret parties later. Many versions later.
Many wishes later.
Many painful holes later. Many toys later. Many forks later. Much tranquility later. 1 bus ride later. 1 humongous meal later. 1 semester later. 1 season later. 8 semesters later.
1 debt to society later.
1 journey through space later. 1 very long digestive tract later.
1 load screen later.
1 loading screen later. 1 loading screen later.
1 little boost to the surface later.
1 mini game later.
1 pathetic soap story later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 1 long angry line later.
1 beautiful Christmas morning later. 1 movie later.
1 shift later.
1 shift later.
1 extremely annoying shift later. 1 winner later.
1 nap later. 1 nap later. 1 operation later.
1 pair of pants later.
1 pair of pants later.
1 scary rod later.
1 trip to the emergency room later. 1 billion, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later.
2 billion, zillion, killion, billion, gorillion space trips later. 3 quintillion, quadrillion, trillion, billion, million, 1,000 times later.
2 idiots later.
3 annoying songs later.
82 kilometers later. 237 holes later.
242 explosions later.
298 frozen patties later.
800 kajillion potatoes later.
861 millenniums later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
Thousands of tears later.
3,000 whoop-whoos later.
5,000 celebrities later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying.
A few inches later, eventually, several bad puns later,
Several bad puns later.
Several bouquets later.
Several thousand ripped pants later.
Some time later.
Even more boat building attempts later. Graduation day.
what if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone? What if SpongeBob was gone?
First lesson, shape-shifting. Next lesson, staring. Haunting houses. Last lesson, how to pick things up.
Epilogue.
Epilogue.
We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.